On a cold Christmas night, the snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the city in an eerie silence. The streets were lifeless, except for the occasional flicker of dim streetlights. In the corner of a desolate alley, a boy no older than 10 sat huddled beneath a threadbare blanket. His breath, visible in the frigid air, puffed out in short bursts as he clutched a small sack to his chest like it held his entire world. He stared into the void of the empty street, his bright blue eyes piercing the darkness with a calmness that seemed unnatural for someone in his condition. Not far from there, in the warmth of his mansion, Harlan DeWitt stared blankly at his untouched dinner. The clatter of the servants cleaning up around him was nothing more than background noise to his thoughts. At 55, Harlan had everything: wealth, status, and a name that carried respect. But his house felt as hollow as the Christmas cheer he had long stopped believing in. His home, filled with grand chandeliers, gilded mirrors, and lavish decorations, looked like something out of a postcard. Yet no family gathered there. No laughter echoed through its halls. The silence was deafening. Harlan rose from the table and walked to the large window overlooking the street. The snow outside glistened under the faint glow of the lamps. That was when he noticed the boy. The figure in the distance, sitting so still in the icy cold, stirred something in him, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to confront in years. With a heavy sigh, he reached for his coat, an instinct he didn't understand pushing him to step outside. As he approached the boy, the crunch of snow under his polished shoes seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. The boy didn't flinch, not even when Harlan stood directly in front of him. "What are you doing out here, boy?" Harlan asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. The boy looked up slowly, his pale face half hidden beneath a mop of messy hair. "Nowhere to go," he replied simply, his voice soft but steady. Harlan frowned. The boy's calmness unnerved him, but he couldn't ignore the sight of the child's bare feet peeking out from under the blanket, red and raw from the cold. "You'll freeze to death out here," Harlan said, more to himself than the boy. "Come with me, I've got a warm bed and food." The boy hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if searching Harlan's face for hidden motives. Then, clutching his sack tighter, he stood and nodded. The two walked in silence back to the mansion, the boy's small footsteps trailing behind Harlan's long strides. Inside, the warmth of the grand hall enveloped them both. The Christmas tree in the corner sparkled with golden lights, its reflection dancing across the polished floors. The boy's eyes flicked briefly to the tree but lingered longer on the shadows it cast on the walls. "What's your name?" Harlan asked as he took the boy's coat, noticing how thin and damp it was. "Noel," the boy said, his voice even quieter now. He didn't offer more, and Harlan didn't press. Instead, he led Noel to a small guest room, its bed neatly made with a thick quilt. "Stay here tonight," Harlan said. "Tomorrow we'll figure something out." Noel stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room, the walls, the window. "Thank you," he said softly, stepping inside. He placed his sack on the bed but kept a hand on it, as though afraid it might disappear if he let go. As Harlan closed the door behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unusual about the boy. For all his frailty and quietness, Noel had an air of control, as if he were the one in charge of the situation. Harlan shrugged it off and returned to the dining room, pouring himself a glass of brandy. But the house felt different now. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper. In the flicker of the fireplace, he thought he saw movement, but when he turned, there was nothing there. He shook his head, dismissing it as his imagination. Still, as he made his way upstairs to his own room, he locked the door, a habit he hadn't practiced in years. In the guest room, Noel sat cross-legged on the bed, his sack still in his lap. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the walls, twisting and stretching in unsettling patterns. From the hallway, faint creaks echoed, as if the house were groaning under an invisible weight. Noel stared at the door, his expression unreadable, and whispered to himself, "He doesn't remember yet, but he will by dawn." The house was quiet as midnight approached, but the quiet felt unnatural, as though the mansion itself was holding its breath. Harlan lay in bed, unable to sleep. The boy's presence in his home lingered in his mind, filling him with an unease he couldn't explain. He turned over, staring at the gilded clock on the mantel. It ticked steadily, but he could swear it was slower than usual, as though time itself had shifted since Noel arrived. Unable to shake the feeling, Harlan rose and slipped on his robe. He padded quietly down the grand staircase, his hand gliding along the polished banister. The house felt colder than usual, the warm air that typically wrapped the mansion now replaced with an icy draft that seemed to come from nowhere. Passing by the guest room, Harlan paused. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled out into the hall. He hesitated, unsure why his hand trembled as he reached to push the door open. The sight inside made his breath catch. Noel sat on the bed, his back to the door, his small frame illuminated by the flickering glow of the candle on the bedside table. The sack that he had clutched so protectively earlier was now open beside him. Harlan could only see its edge, but it seemed empty. Yet Noel sat perfectly still, staring intently at something Harlan couldn't see. "Noel," Harlan called softly, his voice breaking the silence like a crack in glass. The boy turned his head slightly, but not enough for Harlan to see his face. "Couldn't sleep?" Noel asked, his voice steady and calm, as though he'd been expecting Harlan to come. No," Harlan admitted, his hand tightening on the edge of the door. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Noel replied, turning fully now. His blue eyes gleamed in the candlelight, unnaturally bright. "Are you?" The question hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. For a moment, Harlan felt as though the walls were pressing in around him. "Why wouldn't I be?" he asked, his voice tinged with irritation, as though trying to shake off the strange atmosphere. Noel tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I don't know. Sometimes people aren't as all right as they think they are. Sometimes they forget things that matter." Harlan felt his chest tighten, though he couldn't explain why. "You should rest," he said gruffly, stepping back from the door. "We'll talk more in the morning." As he turned to leave, Noel's voice stopped him. "Do you know why they call this night holy?" Harlan froze, his brow furrowing. "Because it's Christmas," he replied without turning back. "It's not because of the birth," Noel said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's because the veil is thinner tonight, between what was and what is, between the living and the dead." The words chilled Harlan more than the draft seeping through the house. He turned to face Noel, but the boy had already turned back toward the sack on the bed, his small hands fiddling with its edge. "Good night, Mr. DeWitt," Noel said, his tone final, leaving no room for further questions. Harlan walked away, his steps faster than before. Back in his room, he locked the door again and leaned against it, his heart pounding. He told himself it was just a child's imagination, words picked up from stories told to him on the street. But deep down, something gnawed at him, a memory he couldn't quite place, as though it were hiding just out of reach. The hours crept by. Outside, the snow fell heavier, muffling the world in its icy embrace. The mansion groaned faintly, its old walls seeming to shift with the weight of secrets long buried. In the early hours of the morning, Harlan awoke to a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. He sat up, his breath fogging in the cold air. The sound wasn't loud, but it was persistent, coming from somewhere downstairs. Throwing on his robe, he stepped out into the hallway. The tapping grew louder as he descended the staircase, his unease deepening with every step. He followed the noise to the sitting room, where the grand Christmas tree stood. The ornaments glittered in the faint moonlight streaming through the large windows. It was then that he saw Noel. The boy was standing in front of the tree, his back to Harlan, tapping his small fingers against the wooden base. The sack lay at his feet, still open, but empty. "Noel!" Harlan called, his voice trembling. The boy turned slowly, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the tree lights. His eyes locked onto Harlan's, and for the first time, Harlan saw something in them that made his blood run cold. Not the innocence of a child, but something far older. "You don't remember yet," Noel said, his voice soft but carrying a weight that sent shivers down Harlan's spine. But you will. Before Harlan could respond, the grandfather clock in the corner struck 3. The chime echoed through the room, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. The lights on the tree, the snow outside, even Harlan's breath. And then the tapping stopped. Harlan stared at Noel, his chest tightening with a fear he couldn't rationalize. The boy's words, spoken with such calm certainty, echoed in his mind. You don't remember yet, but you will. His hands trembled as he stepped closer, trying to mask the unease growing in his stomach. What are you talking about? Harlan demanded, his voice unsteady. Remember what? Noel tilted his head, the faint glow of the tree lights casting shadows across his face. It's not my place to tell you, he said softly. Some things you have to see for yourself. Before Harlan could press further, the room seemed to shift. The lights on the Christmas tree flickered, their warm glow fading into a strange, dim hue that painted the room in unsettling shades. The air grew colder, biting at Harlan's skin despite the heavy robe he wore. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat as Noel bent down and reached into the sack. From where he stood, Harlan couldn't see what the boy pulled out, but he heard it, a faint, metallic jingle, almost like the sound of keys rattling against one another. Noel straightened, holding something in his hands, but his body obscured it from view. What is that? Harlan asked, taking a hesitant step forward. Noel turned his head slightly, his blue eyes glinting in the faint light. Do you want to see? Harlan hesitated, every instinct telling him to say no, to walk away and leave whatever this was behind. But he couldn't. Something deeper, something primal and inexplicable, compelled him to nod. Noel stepped aside, revealing what he held, a small, rusted key attached to a loop of frayed string. Harlan's heart sank as he looked at it. It was nothing remarkable at first glance, but the sight of it filled him with a strange, suffocating dread. He knew this key. Where did you get that? Harlan whispered, his voice barely audible. Noel didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward the fireplace, his bare feet making no sound against the polished floor. He stopped in front of the grand hearth and pointed toward the base, where the intricate iron grate rested against the stone. There, Noel said simply, his small hand outstretched. Harlan frowned. What are you talking about? It's been waiting, Noel said, his voice as calm as ever. Just like me. The room seemed to grow even colder as Harlan approached the fireplace. He crouched down, his breath visible in the freezing air, and hesitated. For a moment, he thought he heard something. A faint whisper, barely perceptible, coming from behind the grate. Shaking his head, he reached out and pulled it aside. Behind the grate was a small, hidden compartment in the stone. It was so expertly concealed that Harlan would have never noticed it had Noel not pointed it out. His fingers trembled as he reached into the dark recess, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst. When he pulled his hand back, it held a small wooden box. The surface was worn and scratched, the once polished finish dulled by time. But the emblem carved into the lid, a crescent moon surrounded by jagged lines, made Harlan's blood run cold. He knew this box. He had seen it before, though he couldn't remember when or where. His hands shook as he placed it on the ground in front of him. "Open it," Noel said, his voice closer now. Harlan looked up and realized the boy was standing directly behind him, his face eerily serene. "What's in it?" Harlan asked, though part of him already knew he wouldn't like the answer. "You have to remember," Noel replied. "It's the only way." With great hesitation, Harlan reached for the rusted key in Noel's hand. The metal was cold against his skin, almost unnaturally so. He slid it into the lock, and with a soft click, the lid creaked open. Inside, nestled among crumbling velvet lining, was a single photograph. Harlan picked it up, his breath hitching as he held it to the light. The image was faded, but the faces were unmistakable. It was a picture of a young boy standing beside a much younger Harlan, both of them smiling in front of the very same mansion. The boy in the photograph looked exactly like Noel. Harlan's heart raced as fragmented memories began to surface. flashes of laughter, shared secrets, and a Christmas night long ago. But then came the darker memories, the argument, the storm, and the boy's tear-streaked face as he ran out into the night, never to return. "No," Harlan whispered, his voice cracking. "That's not possible." Noel crouched beside him, his expression soft but unrelenting. "You left me," he said quietly. "You promised you wouldn't, but you did." Harlan shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. "I didn't mean to. I looked for you. I tried to find you." "But you didn't," Noel said, his tone devoid of anger but heavy with finality. "You moved on. You forgot." Harlan clutched the photograph, his tears falling freely now. The weight of the past pressed down on him like a tidal wave, threatening to drown him. "I didn't forget," he whispered. I couldn't face it. I couldn't face what I did." Noel stood and looked toward the window, where the first faint glow of dawn began to pierce the darkness. "It's time," he said, his voice softer now. "Time for what?" Harlan asked, his voice trembling. "To remember everything," Noel replied, "and to make it right." Harlan looked back at the photograph, his hands shaking as the memories continued to flood back. He couldn't deny the truth any longer. Noel wasn't just a boy from the streets. He was something much more. Someone he had lost long ago, but who had never truly left. The first rays of sunlight spilled into the room, casting long shadows across the walls. And in that moment, Harlan finally understood. Harlan sat frozen on the floor, clutching the photograph as if it were the only tether keeping him grounded. The truth was undeniable now. Every fragment of memory piecing itself together in his mind like shards of broken glass. Noel wasn't just a strange boy who had appeared on his doorstep. He was his Noel, the little brother he had failed to protect all those years ago. The boy who had vanished on a stormy Christmas night, never to be seen again. The first light of dawn crept through the mansion's tall windows, casting a pale glow across the room. Noel stood by the fireplace, his small figure framed by the fading embers and the gray morning light. He wasn't looking at Harlan anymore. His gaze was fixed on the window, his face calm but distant, as though he was seeing something far beyond the room they shared. "You shouldn't have forgotten me," Noel said softly, breaking the silence. "I didn't forget," Harlan replied, his voice raw with emotion. "I couldn't. He faltered, his grip tightening on the photograph. "I searched for you. I begged the police to find you, but when they didn't, I didn't know what to do." "You moved on," Noel said, turning to face him. His voice wasn't accusatory, but it carried a weight that made Harlan flinch. "You built this house, filled it with things, and tried to bury what happened. But you can't bury the truth forever." Harlan's head dropped, the shame consuming him. "I was young," he whispered. "I was scared. I didn't know how to fix it. I thought if I stopped thinking about it, I could move forward." Noel stepped closer, his bare feet silent against the cold floor. "But I didn't move forward, Harlan. I was stuck, waiting. You were supposed to come for me." The words cut through Harlan like a knife. He looked up at Noel, his tears falling freely now. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. I failed you, and I've carried that guilt every day of my life." Noel's expression softened, but the sadness in his eyes remained. "It's not enough to feel sorry, Harlan. You have to remember everything. Only then can you make it right." The room seemed to darken as Noel spoke, the light of dawn fading as though retreating from the mansion. Harlan felt the temperature drop, a chill settling over him that reached into his very soul. The fire in the hearth flared briefly before extinguishing itself entirely, leaving only the faintest glow of embers behind. And then, Harlan saw it. The room around him began to change, the furniture fading into shadows as a new scene unfolded before his eyes. He was no longer in the sitting room of his grand mansion. He was standing outside, on the very street where he had first found Noel just hours ago. The snow was falling harder now, the wind howling like a living thing. The buildings around him were dark and foreboding, their windows shuttered against the storm. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of a child crying. "Do you remember this?" Noel's voice echoed, though Harlan couldn't see him. "I don't understand," Harlan said, his breath visible in the icy air. "What is this?" "It's the night you lost me," Noel replied. Harlan turned, his heart pounding, and then he saw it. A much younger version of himself, no more than 15, standing in the middle of the snowy street. Beside him was Noel, his small hand clutching Harlan's coat as tears streamed down his face. "Stop crying," the younger Harlan said, his voice sharp with frustration. "I told you, I didn't mean it." "You said you hated me," the younger Noel sobbed, his small frame shaking with cold and grief. "You said you wished I was never born." The older Harlan staggered back, the memory hitting him like a physical blow. He had forgotten this, blocked it out so completely that hearing the words again felt like being suffocated. "I didn't mean it," he whispered, watching the scene unfold. "I didn't mean it." But the younger Harlan didn't offer comfort. Instead, he turned away, his face a mask of anger and guilt. "Go home, Noel," he said over his shoulder. "I need to think." "You left me." Noel's voice echoed again, but this time it was coming from beside him. Harlan turned to see the present-day Noel standing there, his face pale and expressionless. "You walked away, and I followed you. I wanted to make things right, but the storm. It was too much. I got lost." "I didn't know," Harlan said, his voice trembling. "I didn't know you followed me." "You didn't look back," Noel replied, "not once." The scene shifted again. Now Harlan was standing in a snow-covered forest, the trees looming tall and dark around him. He could hear Noel's cries in the distance, faint but desperate. He turned, trying to find the source of the sound, but the woods seemed endless, the shadows closing in on him with every step. "You could have found me," Noel's voice whispered, though it came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "You could have saved me." Harlan dropped to his knees, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. "I didn't know how," he choked out. "I was a boy, Noel. I didn't know what to do." The forest began to dissolve, and Harlan found himself back in the sitting room of his mansion. Noel stood before him, his expression unreadable. "You know the truth now," Noel said. "You know what you did, and now you have to decide." "Decide what?" Harlan asked, his voice hoarse. "Whether you'll let the past define you," Noel replied, "or whether you'll finally make it right." Harlan stared at him, the photograph still clutched in his trembling hands. "How?" he whispered. "How can I make it right?" Noel didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking toward the window, his small figure bathed in the pale light of dawn. "You'll find the way," he said, his voice soft but certain. "But you have to start by letting me go." And with that, he stepped into the light, his form dissolving like mist as the first rays of morning illuminated the room. Harlan sat there, alone but changed. The photograph in his hands seemed heavier now, not with guilt, but with purpose. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He would not let Noel's memory fade again. This time, he would honor it. The morning sun poured into the room, chasing away the shadows that had lingered through the long night. Harlan remained seated on the floor, the photograph of his younger self and Noel resting on his lap. The mansion, usually so suffocatingly silent, now felt alive in a strange way. It was as though the air carried whispers of everything that had happened, every word exchanged, every tear shed. Harlan stood slowly, his knees aching from the cold, hard floor. The weight of what he had experienced bore down on him, yet beneath the heaviness of guilt, a faint glimmer of resolve began to take root. For decades he had buried the pain, the memories, and the truth of that fateful Christmas night. But Noel had brought it all back. Every moment, every choice, every failure. The house seemed different now, not in its appearance, but in its presence. Walking through its vast corridors, Harlan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Not by Noel, but by the memories etched into its walls. He paused by a large mirror in the hallway, his reflection startling him. His face was pale, his eyes tired, But there was something else there, a determination he hadn't seen in himself for years. He turned away from the mirror and headed to the library, where he knew the family records were kept. The room, once his mother's favorite, now stood as a mausoleum of his lineage. Shelves filled with thick, leather-bound books and documents lined the walls, and the faint smell of aged paper lingered in the air. Harlan searched through the drawers of an ornate wooden desk, pulling out letters, deeds, and photographs. He needed to remember everything, not just about Noel, but about their family. As he sifted through the papers, a letter caught his eye. It was addressed to him in a handwriting he hadn't seen in years, his father's. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope, the brittle paper crackling in the stillness. The letter was dated a few months after Noel's disappearance. Harlan, I know you blame yourself for what happened to Noel. I see it in your eyes every day. But you must understand, son, that carrying this guilt will only weigh you down. Your mother and I have forgiven you, even though we know you haven't forgiven yourself. If you ever find him, or if he ever finds his way back to us, promise me you'll give him the life he deserved but never had. That's all I ask of you. The letter ended abruptly, but it was enough to make Harlan's chest tighten with emotion. His father had known, maybe not the details, but he had known Harlan carried a burden too heavy for a boy his age. And now, years later, Noel had returned, if only for a fleeting moment, to remind him of the promise he had yet to fulfill. He sat back in the chair, clutching the letter and the photograph. The resolve inside him grew stronger. Noel had asked him to let go, but that didn't mean forgetting. It meant making amends, even if he could never fully erase the past. Harlan spent the next few hours preparing. He pulled out a faded map of the town and its surrounding areas, his fingers tracing the streets and forests where Noel had disappeared. He knew he couldn't go back in time, but he could honor Noel's memory by ensuring his story wasn't lost to history. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Harlan made his way to the local churchyard. The snow-covered graves lay silent under the winter sun, the only sound the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground. He stopped at a small, unmarked headstone near the back of the cemetery. It was a grave his parents had insisted on placing after years of searching yielded no answers. Noel's name was etched into the stone, along with the date of his disappearance. Harlan knelt in the snow, his breath visible in the cold air. "I don't know if you're still here," he began, his voice trembling. "But I want you to know. I'll make it right, Noel. I'll make sure people remember you, not as someone who was lost, but as someone who was loved." The wind picked up slightly, brushing against his face like a faint caress. Harlan closed his eyes, tears slipping down his cheeks. For the first time in decades, the weight on his chest seemed to lift, if only slightly. Returning to the mansion, Harlan made a decision. He would turn the empty, hollow house into something meaningful. He would open its doors to children in need, to those who had no place to go, just as Noel had once had no place to go. It would be a home, a sanctuary, a place where no child would ever feel abandoned or forgotten. As he stood in the grand hall, looking up at the towering Christmas tree, a sense of peace settled over him. The shadows that had haunted him for so long seemed to retreat, replaced by the light of a new purpose. In the corner of the room, near the fireplace, he thought he saw a flicker of movement. For a moment he could swear he saw Noel standing there, his blue eyes bright and his small hand clutching the sack. But when Harlan blinked, the vision was gone. All that remained was a faint warmth in the air and the echo of a child's laughter, so soft it might have been his imagination. Or perhaps it wasn't. Harlan's transformation began that very day. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation and regret, slowly came to life with the purpose he had chosen for it. The first step was clearing out the rooms that had long gathered dust. Rooms that had been intended for a family he never built, spaces that had once mocked his loneliness. As the days turned to weeks, Harlan worked tirelessly to repurpose his home. Letters were written, meetings were held, and connections were made with local charities and shelters. He reached out to organizations that cared for abandoned and orphaned children, offering his mansion as a refuge. Slowly, the house began to fill, not just with furniture and supplies, but with the sound of laughter, footsteps, and voices echoing through its grand halls. Children of all ages arrived, each carrying their own stories of hardship and loss. Harlan greeted every one of them personally, his demeanor no longer cold and detached, but warm and welcoming. The once empty dining room was now bustling with activity during meals, the long table finally fulfilling its purpose. Among the children there was a boy named Oliver, who bore an uncanny resemblance to Noel. Though his hair was darker and his eyes a softer shade of brown, there was something in his quiet nature and the way he observed the world that reminded Harlan of his brother. Oliver often sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames much like Noel had done that fateful night. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, Harlan found Oliver sitting alone in the library, a book resting on his lap but clearly untouched. The boy's gaze was fixed on the window, where the snowflakes danced in the glow of the streetlights. "Can't sleep?" Harlan asked gently, stepping into the room. Oliver turned, startled for a moment before nodding. "It's too quiet sometimes," he said softly. Harlan smiled, taking a seat across from him. "I used to feel the same way about this house," he admitted. "But you know what I've learned? Sometimes the quiet has things to tell us, if we're willing to listen." Oliver tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Like what?" "Like the stories of those who came before us," Harlan replied, his voice tinged with emotion. "The people we've lost, but who never truly leave us." Oliver didn't say anything for a moment, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Do you think they watch over us?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Harlan's chest tightened. "I do," he said firmly, "and I think they want us to be happy, to find peace, even when it feels impossible." The boy nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I hope so," he murmured. As Oliver left the library that night, Harlan remained seated, staring at the fireplace. He thought of Noel, of the boy he had lost, but who had found a way back to him after all these years. The photograph was still in his pocket, a constant reminder of the promise he had made. That night, Harlan dreamed of the forest, but this time, it wasn't dark or foreboding. The snow was soft and glistening, the trees bathed in golden light. In the distance, he saw a figure, a small boy standing at the edge of the woods, his back to Harlan. "Noel," Harlan called, his voice filled with both hope and sorrow. The boy turned slowly, and for a fleeting moment his face was clear. He was smiling, not the faint, sad smile Harlan had seen before, but one of genuine joy. Then he raised his hand, waved, and began walking deeper into the woods. Harlan woke with a start, tears streaming down his face. But for the first time in years, they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of release, of gratitude, and of hope. Over time, the mansion became known as a place of healing. Children who had been abandoned or forgotten found comfort and safety within its walls. They played in the gardens, read books in the library, and decorated the grand Christmas tree each year. Harlan watched over them like a father, his once hardened heart now softened by the purpose he had found. Every Christmas he lit a special candle and placed it on the mantel above the fireplace, a tribute to Noel. It burned brightly throughout the night, a symbol of remembrance and love. And though the mansion was filled with life and laughter, Harlan often felt a quiet presence by his side, as if Noel was still watching, still guiding him. Years later, as Harlan grew older, he found himself sitting by the fireplace once more, surrounded by children who had grown into young adults, their lives changed by the home he had created. He looked around at their smiling faces, the warmth of the fire reflecting in their eyes, and felt a deep sense of peace. And as the snow fell softly outside, Harlan glanced toward the window. For just a moment, he thought he saw a boy standing in the garden, his blue eyes shining like stars. The boy waved once before disappearing into the night, leaving Harlan with a smile and a heart finally at rest. As the years passed, the mansion's reputation as a place of hope and refuge grew far beyond the town's borders. People came not only to seek shelter for their children, but to marvel at how a once cold and hollow house had been transformed into a sanctuary of warmth and love. Harlan, now graying and slower in his movements, became a quiet symbol of redemption. One crisp December morning, Harlan stood by the grand window in the sitting room, watching the first snow of the season fall gently across the garden. The children, bundled in scarves and coats, laughed and played outside, their voices ringing out like music. He smiled, his hand resting lightly on the mantel where Noel's candle had already been placed, waiting to be lit for Christmas Eve. The door to the sitting room creaked open, and Oliver, now a teenager, stepped inside. He was taller now, his frame lanky but strong, and his once timid demeanor had grown into quiet confidence. In many ways, he reminded Harlan of himself at that age, full of questions about the world, yet unsure where he fit within it. "Mr. DeWitt," Oliver began, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "Do you have a minute?" "Always, Oliver," Harlan replied, turning to face him. Oliver hesitated, his hands fidgeting with a loose thread on his sweater. "I've been thinking about what you said last Christmas, about people who never really leave us." Harlan nodded, gesturing for Oliver to sit on the plush armchair by the fire. "What's on your mind?" Oliver took a deep breath, his brown eyes meeting Harlan's. Do you think Noel ever forgave you? For what happened?" The question caught Harlan off guard, though it shouldn't have. Oliver had always been perceptive, attuned to the unspoken emotions that lingered in the mansion. Harlan leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the candle on the mantel. "I like to think he did," Harlan said after a moment, his voice soft but certain. "When he came back to me that night, it wasn't out of anger. He didn't want revenge or to punish me. He wanted me to remember him, to honor what we had. I think that's his way of forgiving me." Oliver nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "Do you ever feel like he's still here?" "All the time," Harlan admitted, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Not in the way you might think. No shadows or whispers in the dark, but in the way this house feels alive now, the way it seems to breathe with the laughter of everyone here. That's him, that's Noel." Oliver's expression softened, and for a moment he was silent. Then he said, "I think you've made him proud." The words struck something deep within Harlan. He leaned forward, resting a hand on Oliver's shoulder. "Thank you, Oliver. That means more to me than you know." That evening, as the snow continued to fall, Harlan gathered everyone in the sitting room. The grand Christmas tree sparkled with golden lights, its ornaments reflecting the glow of the fire. The children and staff crowded around, their faces alight with excitement. Harlan stood before them, holding Noel's candle in his hands. "Every year," he began, his voice carrying the weight of tradition, "we light this candle to remember those who are no longer with us, but whose love continues to guide us. This year is no different." He placed the candle on the mantel and lit it, the small flame flickering to life. For a moment, the room was silent, the light of the candle casting a warm glow across their faces. "May this house always be a place where no one feels forgotten," Harlan said. "May it be a home for those who need it most." The children clapped and cheered, their voices filling the room with joy. As they began singing Christmas carols, Harlan stepped back, his heart full. As the evening wore on, Harlan found himself alone in the sitting room, the others having gone off to bed. The candle still burned brightly, its flame steady and strong. He sat by the fire, watching the shadows dance across the walls. And then, just as he was about to retire for the night, he felt it. A presence, faint but unmistakable. He turned slowly, his eyes landing on the reflection in the window. Standing in the garden, bathed in moonlight, was a boy. He looked just as he had all those years ago, small, with bright blue eyes and a gentle smile. He raised his hand in a silent wave, and Harlan's breath caught in his throat. He rose from his chair and stepped closer to the window, his hand resting against the cold glass. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling. The boy's smile widened, and then, as the wind swept through the garden, he was gone. Harlan stood there for a long time, staring out into the snow. He didn't feel sad or afraid. He felt peace, a peace he had spent a lifetime searching for. That night, as he climbed the stairs to his room, Harlan realized something profound. Noel hadn't just come back to remind him of his guilt. He had come back to remind him of love, of connection, and of the importance of holding on to what truly mattered. And though the boy was gone, his presence remained in every corner of the mansion, in the laughter of the children, in the warmth of the fire, and in the light of the candle that burned brightly through the night. The years continued to pass, and the mansion's legacy only grew stronger. What had started as a quiet act of redemption became a beacon of hope for countless children. Harlan, now an old man, walked the halls with a slow but steady pace, his presence still commanding yet gentle. The laughter of children, the hum of activity, and the warmth of shared meals filled every corner of the house. It was no longer a place of regret, but one of renewal and belonging. One crisp winter morning, Harlan sat in the library gazing out at the snow-covered garden. The frost clung to the bare branches of the trees, and the distant sound of children playing drifted through the air. He held the photograph of himself and Noel in his hands, the edges worn from years of handling. This photograph had become his touchstone, a reminder of the promise he had made and fulfilled in ways he had never imagined. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Oliver stepped in, now a young man with broad shoulders and a confident stride. He carried a stack of papers under one arm and a book under the other, his expression a mix of excitement and determination. "Mr. DeWitt," Oliver began, his voice rich and steady, "I've been working on something I think you'll want to see." Harlan smiled and gestured for him to sit. "What is it, Oliver?" Oliver set the papers on the desk in front of him. "It's the history of the mansion," he explained. "Your history. I've gathered stories from everyone who has passed through these walls. Children, staff, even some of the townspeople who remember when this house was just a big, empty place. I want to turn it into a book, something that tells the world what you've done here." Harlan's brow furrowed as he picked up one of the pages. The words blurred slightly before his tired eyes, but the meaning was clear. Each story, each memory, was a testament to the lives that had been changed within these walls. He set the paper down and looked at Oliver, his eyes misty. "You've done something wonderful, Oliver," Harlan said, his voice thick with emotion. "But this isn't just my history. It's yours too. It belongs to everyone who has called this place home." Oliver smiled, a hint of pride in his expression. "That's exactly why it needs to be written, so no one ever forgets." Harlan nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "You have my blessing," he said softly, "and my thanks." Over the next few weeks, the project became a collective effort. Children and staff shared their stories, their laughter and tears mingling as they recounted their experiences. Old photographs were unearthed, drawings were made, and even Harlan contributed, his deep, steady voice recounting the moment he first opened the mansion's doors to those in need. As Christmas approached, the mansion buzzed with preparations for the annual celebration. This year was special, not just because of the book, but because it marked the 50th anniversary of the mansion's transformation. The tree was taller than ever, its golden lights glowing brightly against the deep green branches. Ornaments made by the children over the years hung alongside intricate glass baubles, each one telling a story. On Christmas Eve, the sitting room was packed. Children, young and old, gathered around the tree, their faces glowing with excitement. Staff members stood along the walls, their smiles warm as they watched the scene unfold. At the center of it all sat Harlan, his presence still commanding despite his frailty. Oliver stood beside him, holding a leather-bound book, the first completed copy of the mansion's history. He opened it to the first page, where a dedication was written in bold, elegant letters. "To Noel, whose light guided us all." Harlan's breath hitched as he read the words. The room was silent, every eye on him. He looked up, his gaze meeting Oliver's. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This means more than I can say." Oliver handed the book to Harlan, who held it close to his chest. The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the high ceilings and filling the space with life. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Harlan sat alone in the sitting room. The candle on the mantel burned brightly, its flame steady and unwavering. He traced his fingers over the leather cover of the book, his mind drifting to memories of Noel. The room was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt full, not empty. The kind of quiet that carried the whispers of love, forgiveness, and connection. As he leaned back in his chair, his eyes growing heavy with sleep, Harlan felt a warmth settle over him. And as the candle flickered gently in the darkness, he swore he heard it again. That faint, familiar laughter, echoing softly through the halls, reminding him that Noel's light would never truly fade. Harlan smiled, his heart full and his soul at peace. For the first time in his life, he felt complete. The mansion, the children, the legacy, they were all part of something greater, something lasting. And in that moment, he knew Noel was watching, his presence as strong as ever, guiding him home. As another year turned, the mansion thrived as a haven for those in need, its story reaching far beyond the boundaries of the small town. Journalists, historians, and philanthropists began to visit, drawn by the remarkable transformation of Harlan DeWitt and the legacy of his mansion. They marveled at how one man's regret had grown into a legacy of compassion, with roots so deep they seemed eternal. Harlan, though now slower and more frail, remained at the heart of it all. Each day he walked the halls of the mansion, his cane tapping rhythmically against the polished wooden floors. The children greeted him with smiles, their laughter trailing in his wake. Despite the age etched into his face, there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there in his younger years, a light born of purpose and redemption. One particular morning, as snow fell in delicate flakes outside, Harlan received a letter. It was from a woman who had grown up in the mansion many years ago. Her name was Eleanor, and she was one of the first children he had taken in after opening his doors. Now an accomplished doctor, she wrote to thank Harlan for giving her the foundation that had shaped her life. "You didn't just give me a roof over my head," the letter read. "You gave me a family, a sense of belonging. You taught me that even the most broken things can be rebuilt. Because of you, I've learned to extend that same kindness to others. The world is a better place because of you, Mr. DeWitt." Harlan folded the letter carefully, his hands trembling slightly. Each word carried the weight of a lifetime of effort and the fulfillment of his promise to Noel. These moments were what kept him going, what gave meaning to the years he had spent trying to make amends for the past. That evening, he shared the letter with Oliver, who now played an integral role in managing the mansion's day-to-day activities. As Harlan read it aloud, his voice steady but soft, Oliver listened intently, his expression a mix of admiration and pride. "She's right," Oliver said when Harlan finished. "What you've built here, it's more than just a home. It's a legacy. It's proof that we can change, that we can make things better no matter how much we've lost." Harlan smiled, his gaze drifting to the candle on the mantel. "It's not just me," he said. "This place exists because of everyone who's passed through it, because of you, Oliver, and the children, and because of Noel, his light never left." Oliver nodded, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. "You've done so much, but you've carried this weight for so long. Do you ever think about letting go?" Harlan was silent for a moment, his thoughts turning inward. "I think letting go isn't about forgetting," he said finally. "It's about knowing that what you've done is enough, that the ones you've lost would be proud of the life you've lived." Oliver didn't reply, but the understanding in his eyes was enough. As the weeks passed, preparations for another Christmas celebration began. This year, the children decided to perform a play, reenacting the history of the mansion and its transformation. They threw themselves into the project with enthusiasm, creating costumes, painting backdrops, and rehearsing their lines late into the evening. Harlan watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride. The play wasn't just a tribute to him, it was a tribute to everyone who had contributed to the mansion's story. On Christmas Eve, the children gathered in the sitting room, their makeshift stage set up before the grand Christmas tree. The room was filled with staff, former residents, and even visitors from the town. The performance began, the children narrating the story of Harlan's life with sincerity and joy. They spoke of the mansion's transformation, of the countless lives it had touched, and of the boy who had inspired it all, Noel. When the play ended, the room erupted in applause, the sound echoing through the mansion's high ceilings. Harlan, seated in the front row, wiped a tear from his cheek as he stood to address the audience. "This house," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion in it, "was once a place of sorrow. It was a reflection of a man who had lost his way. But through the kindness of others, through the laughter and love of children, it has become something greater. It has become a home." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. "None of this would have been possible without each and every one of you, and none of it would have happened without Noel. He was my brother, my guiding star, and though he is no longer with us, his light shines through all of you." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Then, slowly, they rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, their voices ringing out in celebration of the man who had given so much. As the evening wore on and the festivities continued, Harlan found a quiet moment to himself by the fireplace. The candle burned brightly, its flame steady and unwavering. He stared into the fire, his thoughts drifting to the past, to Noel and to the journey that had brought him here. And then he felt it, a warmth that wasn't from the fire. It was a presence, faint but unmistakable. He didn't turn, didn't need to. He knew Noel was there, just as he had been every Christmas since that fateful night. Harlan smiled, his heart full. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire, "for giving me a second chance, for never letting me forget." The warmth lingered for a moment longer before fading, leaving Harlan with a sense of peace so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He knew this would be his last Christmas in the mansion, but he also knew that his work was done. The legacy he had built would endure, carried forward by Oliver and the countless others who had found a home within its walls. As the clock struck midnight, marking the start of Christmas Day, Harlan closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. The candle on the mantel burned brightly, its light a symbol of everything he had gained, and everything he had given. And in the quiet of the room, amidst the laughter and joy of the mansion, Harlan felt whole. The days following Christmas were quieter, the joy of the celebration lingering like a warm glow in the mansion. Harlan spent more time in the sitting room by the fire, often with Oliver by his side. The young man had grown into a natural leader, taking on more responsibilities each day. Harlan saw in him the strength and kindness that had once eluded his younger self. One snowy afternoon, as the children played outside, Harlan called Oliver to his side. The fire crackled softly, and the candle on the mantel burned steadily, its warm light illuminating the room. "Oliver," Harlan began, his voice calm but firm, "it's time for me to step back." Oliver frowned, his brow furrowing. "Step back? From what?" "From the mansion," Harlan said gently. "I've given it everything I can. But you're ready to carry it forward. You've been ready for a while now." Oliver shook his head, his voice trembling slightly. "I can't do this without you. None of us can." Harlan reached out, placing a hand on Oliver's shoulder. "You can," he said firmly. "And you will. This place isn't just about me, Oliver. It's about the children, the staff, and people like you who make it what it is. It's time for me to rest." Tears welled in Oliver's eyes, but he nodded, understanding the weight of Harlan's words. "I'll honor what you've built," he said softly. "I promise." Harlan smiled, his face lined with both age and peace. "I know you will. You've already made me proud." Over the next few weeks, Harlan prepared for his departure. He handed over the mansion's operations to Oliver, ensuring every detail was in place. The children sensed the change but didn't fully understand what it meant. To them, Harlan had always been there, a constant presence of warmth and safety. On his final morning at the mansion, Harlan stood in the garden, watching as the sun rose over the snow-covered grounds. The light cast long shadows across the trees, and the air was crisp and still. He closed his eyes, taking in the moment, feeling the peace he had long sought. As he turned to leave, he paused by the sitting room one last time. The candle on the mantel still burned, its flame steady and unwavering. Harlan smiled, knowing it would continue to burn, a symbol of everything the mansion had come to represent. He stepped outside, his cane tapping softly against the stone steps, and made his way to a waiting car. Oliver stood at the door, watching him go, his expression a mix of sadness and resolve. The mansion thrived under Oliver's care, its legacy continuing to grow with each passing year. Stories of Harlan DeWitt and the transformation of his home became legend, inspiring others to create spaces of hope and healing in their own communities. And though Harlan's physical presence faded, his spirit never truly left. Each Christmas, as the candle on the mantel burned, those who lived within the mansion's walls felt his warmth, his guidance, and his love. Years later, Oliver stood in the sitting room, now an older man himself. The candle still burned, its flame as bright as ever. He turned to a group of children seated before the fire and began to tell them a story. The story of a man who turned his sorrow into something beautiful, of a boy whose light guided them all, and of a mansion that became a home. As Oliver spoke, a soft wind rustled through the room, and for just a moment, the candle's flame flickered. He paused, a faint smile on his lips, knowing that Harlan and Noel were still there, their presence as strong as ever. And so the mansion continued to stand, a beacon of love, redemption, and hope, forever illuminated by the light of those who had come before.